In the ashes of post-war Europe, one man refused to let the crimes of the Holocaust fade into silence. Simon Wiesenthal, a survivor of Nazi brutality, emerged from the ruins not to rebuild his own life, but to dedicate it entirely to tracking down those who had destroyed millions, turning memory into justice. Simon Wiesenthal was born on December 31, 1908, in Bugzaks, a quiet town that lay within the fading borders of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now part of Ukraine. His childhood unfolded in a world still recovering from the turbulence of war and empire. His father, Asher Wiesenthal, served in the Austro-Hungarian army during the First World War and died on the Eastern Front when Simon was still a child. His mother, Rosa, raised Simon and his younger brother, Hillel, amid the shifting lines of power that defined Eastern Europe. As the old empire collapsed and Poland regained its independence, Bugzaks found itself swept into the reborn Polish state. For Jewish families like the Wiesenthals, the changes brought both promise and danger. Old prejudices resurfaced under new flags. Simon was a bright student, fascinated by drawing, mathematics, and architecture. He dreamed of shaping cities, not surviving their destruction. After completing his early education in Lwów, he applied to study architecture at the Lwów Polytechnic Institute. However, anti-Semitic quotas made it almost impossible for Jewish students to enter. Undeterred, Wiesenthal enrolled at the Czech Technical University in Prague in 1928, a city more open to Jewish intellectual life. There he immersed himself in design, engineering, and the optimism of modernist Europe. He graduated in 1932, full of ambition, and returned to Lwów to begin his career. He married Sila Miller in 1936, a woman known for her grace and quiet strength. Together they built dreams of a modest but happy future, a home, children, and a career untouched by politics. But the Europe of the 1930s was darkening. The rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany and growing anti-Semitism in neighboring countries signaled an approaching storm. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Lwów fell under Soviet occupation as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. For the moment, Wiesenthal's life was spared the horrors unfolding in Western Poland. Under Soviet rule, his architectural business was nationalized, and he worked for a state design bureau. The Soviets distrusted professionals, especially those from the pre-war middle class, but for 2 years, Wiesenthal and Sila survived in relative safety, though constantly watched by the NKVD. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht swept across Eastern Europe, and within days, Lwów fell into Nazi hands. For its Jewish population, this was the beginning of annihilation. Pogroms erupted as German forces encouraged local collaborators to attack Jewish neighborhoods. Simon witnessed the unthinkable. Neighbors turning on neighbors, the streets running with blood, the city's centuries-old Jewish life collapsing overnight. His stepfather, Solomon, was murdered by Ukrainian collaborators. Soon after, Simon and Sila were forced into one of the city's first ghettos. The dream of an architectural life vanished. Survival became the only design left. The Germans soon established a system of forced labor camps around Lwów. Wiesenthal was assigned to the Janowska camp, where he worked as a draftsman for the Ostbahn repair workshops that serviced the German railways. It was his skill with precision drawing that saved his life more than once. The camp was a place of systematic terror. Shootings, hangings, and arbitrary executions occurred daily. Wiesenthal learned that each day survived was an act of resistance in itself. He used his position to help others, falsifying lists to spare fellow inmates from execution, sketching documents that might buy them time, passing scraps of food when possible. He was not yet a hero in any conventional sense, but the roots of his later moral mission were being shaped in the mud and cruelty of Janowska. In 1942, the Germans began deporting Jews from Lwów to the extermination camp at Bayek. Trains packed with thousands disappeared into the forests of eastern Poland, never to return. Wiesenthal's mother was among those deported. She was taken from her home and sent to Bayek, where she was murdered upon arrival. The loss haunted Simon for the rest of his life. From that moment, His survival gained a new meaning, not for himself, but for remembrance. "I would live to tell," he would later say. Each atrocity witnessed, each name memorized, became a record in his mind, a ledger of justice waiting to be written. By 1943, Wiesenthal and his wife realized that survival inside the camp was no longer possible. With the help of a sympathetic Polish foreman and members of the underground resistance, they planned their escape. Sila managed to flee first, finding shelter under a false identity in Warsaw. Simon attempted escape soon after but was captured and returned to Janowska. Miraculously, he was not executed. Again spared because his technical skills were deemed too valuable. Still, he knew the clock was ticking. In late 1943, as the Red Army began to advance westward, the Nazis intensified their liquidation of ghettos and camps to erase evidence of their crimes. Thousands of prisoners from Janowska were murdered during this period in mass shootings known as the Harvest Festival killings. Wiesenthal escaped again shortly before the camp's liquidation in November 1943, slipping away under cover of chaos and hiding in the attic of a Polish railway worker's home in Lwów. For months he lived in a space barely large enough to lie down, surviving on crusts of bread and water, listening to the sounds of war echoing through the city below. Each knock on the door threatened discovery and death. When German patrols searched nearby buildings, Wiesenthal contemplated suicide rather than return to the camp. Yet, somehow hope, or perhaps defiance, kept him alive. In mid-1944, he was discovered once more by the Gestapo and sent to the Przymical labor camp. There he witnessed the final, desperate phase of the Nazi regime. Exhausted guards, collapsing front lines, but continued brutality. In July 1944, as Soviet forces approached, the Germans began evacuating prisoners deeper into the Reich. Wiesenthal was forced onto a transport to Krakow-Plazau, and from there to a succession of camps: Gross, Rosen, Buchenwald, Mauthausen. Each transfer claimed the lives of thousands. Each stop along the way etched another scar into his memory. Mauthausen in Austria became his final ordeal. Built on a granite quarry, it was one of the most brutal camps in the Nazi system, a place where exhaustion and starvation were weapons of murder. Prisoners carried massive stones up the stairs of death, collapsing under the weight while guards laughed. Disease and hunger claimed lives by the hour. Wiesenthal, skeletal and fevered, could barely walk by the spring of 1945. Yet even here, fragments of humanity survived. Prisoners shared bits of bread, whispered news of the Allied advance, clung to rumors that the end near. On May 5, 1945, American forces of the 11th Armored Division liberated Mauthausen. Wiesenthal was found barely alive, weighing less than 100 pounds, too weak to stand. The soldiers photographed him on a cot, his hollow eyes staring out from a body that seemed more shadow than flesh. Liberation did not bring joy, only silence, a silence filled with ghosts. Out of 89 members of his extended family, only he and Sila survived. She had been rescued months earlier by the Red Army, and through the efforts of relief organizations, they were reunited after the war. When Simon saw her again, it was as if two fragments of a shattered mirror found each other among the ruins of Europe. In the displaced persons camps that followed liberation, Wiesenthal faced a choice. Many survivors tried to rebuild their lives, to leave the past behind. But for Simon, the past demanded reckoning. The faces of murdered family members, the echo of screams from Janowska, the names of SS officers who vanished into civilian life. These memories formed a mission that would define his existence. Justice, he believed, could not rest while the guilty walked free. He began by gathering testimonies from other survivors, recording names, ranks, dates, and places. In 1945, he compiled his first dossier on Nazi perpetrators, submitting it to Allied war crimes investigators. At first, few officials took him seriously. The world was exhausted, eager to move forward. But Wiesenthal persisted. He worked for the U.S. Army's War Crimes Office in Linz, assisting in the identification of SS officers and camp personnel. His meticulous nature and architectural precision translated into a forensic approach to justice. Where others saw chaos, Wiesenthal saw patterns, networks of fugitives, routes of escape, connections between aliases and former ranks. As post-war tribunals at Nuremberg made headlines, countless lower-ranking perpetrators slipped away into obscurity. Many fled to Latin America, the Middle East, or simply blended back into German society. Wiesenthal refused to let them vanish. He began corresponding with international organizations, building archives from survivor statements, newspaper clippings, and official records. His tiny office in Linz became known as the Documentation Center. He had no funding, no staff, only a mission born of memory and moral outrage. Each day he received letters from across Europe, survivors who remembered a name, a face, a uniform patch. Each piece of information became part of a growing web that would one day bring hundreds of war criminals to justice. But those years of work belonged to a different chapter. The chapter of pursuit, confrontation, and revelation. Before that relentless quest began, Wiesenthal needed to heal enough to walk again, to breathe without fear. He remained haunted by nightmares of the camps, by the sense that the world might soon forget. His survival, he realized, was not the end of the story. It was its beginning. In those fragile months after liberation, he began to write, sketching fragments of memory into reports and drawings. He created diagrams of the camps, maps of deportations, lists of SS men who had commanded or killed. His trained eye as an architect helped him reconstruct places of horror with chilling accuracy. The layout of Janoska, the rail lines to Bediek, the barracks at Mauthausen. Each detail served a purpose: to preserve truth. He saw truth not as obstruction but as a structure, something that could be built brick by brick from evidence and testimony, strong enough to withstand denial. Europe in 1945 was a landscape of ruin, cities flattened, borders redrawn, millions displaced. Amid this chaos, justice seemed almost an afterthought. Yet Wiesenthal believed that the moral architecture of the future depended on confronting the crimes of the past. Even as survivors searched for food and shelter, he searched for names. The task would consume his life, but at that moment, he was still just one man. Thin, wary, holding a notebook and a memory too heavy to bear. When the war ended, Simon Wiesenthal might have chosen to forget, to bury his pain under the rubble of history. Instead, he made memory his weapon. In the shadow of genocide, he found purpose. And in the silence of the liberated camps, he began to hear the quiet call of justice. A call that would echo through the rest of his life. The war had ended, but for Simon Wiesenthal, it was as if a different kind of battle had only just begun. In the shattered landscape of post-war Europe, where survivors wandered roads in search of families and millions of displaced persons waited in makeshift camps, he refused to let the machinery of Nazi terror vanish into the ruins. His health was fragile, his body still recovering from starvation and disease. But his mind burned with purpose. Each name, each face he remembered, became a thread pulling him forward through exhaustion and despair. In 1946, Wiesenthal began working with the U.S. Army's War Crimes Office in Linz, Austria. He assisted in identifying SS officers, camp guards, and collaborators. The Allied forces were gathering evidence for trials that would define the post-war era, not only at Nuremberg, but in dozens of smaller proceedings across Europe. Wiesenthal's ability to recall details from memory astonished investigators. He could remember names, ranks, and the layout of camps with near photographic clarity. But as the months passed, he noticed that attention was already shifting. The Allied focus was moving toward rebuilding Germany, and the Cold War was beginning to shape new priorities. Many lower-ranking Nazis slipped through the cracks, blending back into society or disappearing entirely. Wiesenthal, working out of a small room with barely enough money to pay for postage, began collecting information on his own. He wrote letters to survivors scattered across Europe, asking for testimonies, photographs, and memories of those responsible for atrocities. Slowly, he created what would become one of the most important private archives of Nazi war crimes in the world. In 1947, he founded the Jewish Historical Documentation Center in Linz. Its goal was simple but immense: to gather evidence for future trials, and to ensure that the names of the perpetrators would never be forgotten. The center began with little more than a desk, a few filing cabinets, and a typewriter. Wiesenthal worked day and night, supported by a handful of volunteers. The early years were difficult. Many survivors wanted to move on, to escape the shadow of the camps. Others feared retaliation or simply doubted that justice was possible. Still, Wiesenthal persisted. He tracked reports from newspapers, court documents, and Red Cross lists, matching fragments of information with names he had memorized. His training as an architect had taught him to see patterns and connections, skills he now applied to the reconstruction of crimes and identities. By 1948, his files contained tens of thousands of entries. Each one represented a potential lead: a camp guard living under an alias, a Gestapo officer who had escaped to South America, a doctor who had performed experiments in Auschwitz and was now practicing medicine in another name. For Wiesenthal, these records were more than paper. They were unfinished stories waiting for justice. But in the shifting politics of the post-war years, the pursuit of Nazi criminals began to lose momentum. In 1954, the Documentation Center was forced to close. Many of its archives were transferred to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, which was being established as Israel's central Holocaust memorial and research institution. Wiesenthal's personal archive, however, remained with him. The world seemed ready to forget, but he could not. He found work as a journalist and engineer, yet he continued to collect names and information quietly, keeping his files hidden in boxes and drawers. Then, in 1954, he learned something that reignited his mission. The rumor that Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the final solution, was still alive. Eichmann had vanished after the war, evading Allied capture. Official records listed him as dead, but Wiesenthal doubted it. His sources whispered that Eichmann had fled Europe, possibly to Argentina under a false identity. For Wiesenthal, this was the case that could prove to the world that justice was still possible. He reopened his Linz office in 1953, without funding or official support, and began gathering every possible lead on Eichmann. He contacted survivors, former SS members, journalists, and diplomats. Slowly, the picture came into focus. Eichmann had indeed escaped, using the rat lines, secret routes organized by Nazi sympathizers and clerical networks that smuggled fugitives out of Europe to South America. Under the alias Ricardo Clement, he was living in Buenos Aires. Wiesenthal passed his findings to Israeli and German authorities, though progress was slow. Then, in 1960, Mossad agents located and captured Eichmann in Argentina, bringing him to Israel for trial. When the news broke, the world's attention turned again to the question of justice for the Holocaust. Though Mossad's investigation had been independent, Wiesenthal's tireless work in keeping Eichmann's name alive had been instrumental in maintaining pressure and focus. The capture validated years of isolation and struggle. The Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961 became a historic event. Survivors testified publicly, describing the machinery of genocide with unflinching detail. For Wiesenthal, it marked not the end of his mission, but its renewal. If Eichmann could be found, others could too. He expanded his search using letters, contacts, and growing networks of journalists and investigators to trace fugitives across continents. His Linz office soon became a hub of information, part detective agency, part archive, part moral tribunal. Among those he helped bring to justice was Karl Silberbauer, the SS officer who had arrested Anne Frank and her family in Amsterdam. For years, Silberbauer had lived quietly in Vienna, working as a police officer. In 1963, following Wiesenthal's investigation, he was identified and suspended. The discovery confirmed the accuracy of Anne Frank's story and restored its historical foundation against those who sought to deny it. Wiesenthal's reputation grew internationally. Reporters began calling him the Nazi hunter. He disliked the dramatization but understood its power. The title gave visibility to his cause, attracting attention to the many fugitives still at large. He began publishing books and giving lectures, warning against indifference and denial. Yet, behind the public image, was the same man who had survived the camps. Meticulous, patient, and unrelenting in pursuit of names on paper. His investigations ranged across Europe and beyond. He traced Franz Stangl, the commandant of Treblinka, to Brazil. He tracked Gustav Wagner, deputy commandant of Sobibor, to Sao Paulo. He gathered files on thousands of others whose names had faded from public memory. Each case required years of work, cross-referencing archives, interviewing witnesses, comparing photographs. Wiesenthal was often dismissed as obsessive, but he saw his work as a form of architectural reconstruction, rebuilding moral foundations from ruins. He faced resistance not only from the fugitives but from political and social forces that preferred silence. In the 1950s and 1960s, both East and West Germany sought stability, and pursuing old war criminals threatened that goal. Many officials who had served the Nazi regime now held positions in government or business. Wiesenthal's insistence on accountability earned him enemies. His office was vandalized, his life threatened. Still, he continued. He believed that justice could not be selective, that every perpetrator, no matter how small their role, represented a fragment of a vast system that had to be confronted. In 1961, Wiesenthal moved his documentation center to Vienna, where it became known as the Jewish Documentation Center. From there, he continued building files on war criminals and exposing networks of former Nazis. His records became invaluable to prosecutors and journalists around the world. Governments sought his help. Survivors sent him letters from across continents, trusting that he would listen when others would not. By the 1970s, his work extended beyond Europe. He tracked reports of Nazis living in the Middle East and Latin America, using diplomatic and journalistic channels to pursue leads. One of his most famous cases involved Hermann Braunsteiner, a former concentration camp guard known as the Stomping Mare, for her cruelty. Wiesenthal located her in Queens, New York, living quietly as a housewife. His discovery led to her extradition to Germany, where she was tried and convicted of war crimes. Throughout these years, Wiesenthal's life was marked by both recognition and controversy. He received honors from multiple countries and met world leaders, but he also faced criticism from those who questioned his methods or his persistence in reopening old wounds. He rarely responded publicly. His focus remained on his files, on the thousands of names that still awaited justice. He often said that his work was not about revenge, but about memory. The preservation of truth in a world eager to forget. He saw himself as a witness extending the life of those who could no longer speak. Each conviction, each trial, was a voice restored to history. In 1973, Wiesenthal played a key role in identifying Franz Stangl in Brazil. Stangl was arrested and extradited to Germany, where he was tried for the murder of 900,000 people at Treblinka. His conviction marked one of the few instances where a high-ranking camp commander faced direct justice. For Wiesenthal, it was both a victory and a reminder of how many others remained unpunished. As the decades passed, he expanded his efforts to combat Holocaust denial and neo-Nazi movements. He worked closely with educators, historians, and law enforcement agencies, sharing his archives and insights. His documentation center became a model for future institutions that study and document crimes against humanity. Despite threats and fatigue, Wiesenthal continued working well into his 80s. His small office in Vienna, lined with filing cabinets and stacks of letters, became a symbol of persistence. Visitors described the atmosphere as quiet but charged, a space where the ghosts of history were organized, cataloged, and prepared for testimony. The digital age began to transform his work in the 1990s. Computers and international databases allowed researchers to connect data faster than ever before. Wiesenthal welcomed these changes, seeing them as a continuation of his mission. He often said that technology could preserve what memory could not. Even as age slowed him, his focus never wavered. In his later years, he became an advisor to institutions such as the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles, which was established to continue his legacy of education, research, and advocacy against hatred. Simon Wiesenthal's life after liberation became a monument built from names, files, and tireless pursuit. He had no weapons, no army, only persistence. He outlived many of those he pursued, not in triumph, but in endurance. His story was not one of vengeance, but of remembrance made active, the transformation of memory into action. In 2003, after more than half a century of work, he announced his retirement, saying simply, "I have found the murderers I was looking for. Now it's time to rest." 2 years later, on September 20, 2005, Simon Wiesenthal passed away in Vienna at the age of 96. When his files were opened, they contained over 22,000 names of suspected war criminals, countless letters, reports, and testimonies. Each page was a fragment of a vast story that he had spent his life piecing together. His funeral was attended by diplomats, survivors, and historians from around the world. In death, as in life, he stood for the belief that justice does not expire with time. The memory of Simon Wiesenthal endures not only in archives and institutions, but in the ongoing search for accountability. His work proved that one survivor's determination could alter the moral landscape of post-war history. Through decades of silence and resistance, he demonstrated that truth, once pursued, could never truly be buried. After Simon Wiesenthal's death in 2005, his mission did not end. It evolved into a global legacy of remembrance and accountability. The archives he had built over 6 decades became an indispensable resource for historians, prosecutors, and educators. The Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles, founded during his lifetime, expanded his vision into an institution dedicated to combating antisemitism, racism, and the denial of genocide. Its Museum of Tolerance carried his message into classrooms and public discourse, transforming the lessons of his pursuit into education for future generations. Governments across the world continued the work that Wiesenthal had pioneered almost single-handedly. His meticulous methods of tracing fugitives influenced the creation of international databases for war crimes and the establishment of institutions such as the International Criminal Court. His files helped prosecutors reopen dormant cases against former SS officers who had lived undisturbed for decades, proving that the passage of time could not erase culpability. The information he preserved became critical evidence in trials throughout the 1980s and 1990s, ensuring that justice remained a living process, not a relic of the post-war years. In Austria, the country where he had spent most of his post-war life, attitudes toward the Nazi past began to shift under the influence of his work. For decades, Austria had portrayed itself as a victim of Germany, distancing itself from the crimes of the Third Reich. Wiesenthal's investigations exposed the complicity of Austrian officials, teachers, and policemen who had served the regime. His persistence forced a national reckoning, compelling institutions to confront their roles in the Holocaust and to acknowledge the truth he had documented since the ruins of 1945. His story became part of the larger narrative of Holocaust remembrance. Schools studied his life as an example of moral endurance and the power of evidence. Filmmakers and authors portrayed him as the embodiment of post-war justice, a man who transformed survival into testimony. Archives bearing his name were established across Europe and the United States, continuing his practice of linking memory with investigation. The Vienna Documentation Center, once a single room crowded with papers, evolved into a modern research facility preserving millions of documents. Wiesenthal's influence reached beyond the Holocaust. His methods inspired efforts to track perpetrators of other atrocities in Rwanda, the Balkans, and beyond. Investigators studying war crimes in modern conflicts cited his example as proof that individuals could challenge impunity through persistence and documentation. His work shaped the way nations responded to crimes against humanity, embedding the idea that evidence must be gathered, preserved, and pursued, no matter how long it takes. In the years following his death, monuments and awards were established in his honor, but his true memorial remained the continuing pursuit of truth. The man who had once emerged from Mauthausen weighing less than 100 pounds had altered the moral landscape of the modern world. From the ruins of post-war Europe to the archives of international justice, Simon Wiesenthal's life formed a bridge between memory and law, between the silence of the dead and the voice of history that refuses to fade.